My name is Rachel Morgan. I am 40 years old. And the last time my family saw me, I was nothing but the dishwasher sister. In our old kitchen in Omaha, my brother pushed a $5,000 check across the table and told me not to come back until I fixed my life. My sister leaned back in her designer blouse and said I was not invited to her wedding, because her wealthy in-laws could never know we came from someone like me. For 3 years, they believed I was scrubbing plates in a truck stop diner, too ashamed to show my face. What they never imagined was the truth I carried with me. And the moment I chose to reveal it in front of every guest at her perfect wedding. By the end of this story, you will see why her words turned into her greatest humiliation, and why I finally answered in a way no one in that room will ever forget. The smell of overcooked pot roast lingered in the kitchen of our old family house in Omaha the night everything broke. I was 40 years old, sitting at the same wooden table where we had eaten countless Sunday dinners. But this time I felt like an outsider in my own bloodline. Lauren sat across from me in a designer blouse, her nails gleaming under the light. And Ethan leaned back in his chair in a suit that screamed expense more than taste. I was wearing the work clothes I had on from a shift earlier that day. Jeans with grease stains and a faded gray shirt. Lauren looked me up and down, her eyes full of that mix of pity and disgust I had known since childhood. She let out a little laugh and shook her head. "Becca," she said, "you actually showed up here looking like that. You are 40 years old and still dressed like a dishwasher." Ethan chuckled, crossing his arms. He nodded toward me like he was delivering a verdict. "It is kind of pathetic. Rachel, you always said you would make something of yourself after the army. But here you are, a dishwasher sister. That is what people call you behind your back." I sat there quietly, letting their words hang in the air. The kitchen had the same wallpaper from when Mom was alive, the same squeaky floorboard near the sink. But without her and Dad, the place felt colder, harsher. I wanted to tell them about the hours I had put in, about the nights I barely slept, about the parts of my life they never saw. But I knew it would not matter. Ethan pulled a checkbook from the inside pocket of his jacket. He clicked his pen slowly, as if savoring the moment, then scribbled his name on the line. He tore the slip of paper and slid it across the table toward me. "Here. $5,000. That should be enough to get you cleaned up. Maybe take some classes. Get yourself together. And Rachel, do us all a favor and stay away until you can prove you belong." I stared at the check. $5,000. To them, it was nothing. A weekend trip to Aspen. A handbag. A line item they would forget by Monday. To me, it was an insult stamped in ink. A price tag they had put on my worth. I did not touch it. I let it sit there on the table, the paper curling at the edge. Lauren leaned forward, folding her hands like she was leading a boardroom meeting. "There is something else you need to know. I am getting married in the spring. Charles proposed last month, and we are having the wedding at Hudson Riverside Country Club. His family is very well known in New York. They are traditional, accomplished, and they value appearances. I cannot have them thinking we come from this kind of background." Her eyes slid over my jeans, my worn shirt, the calluses on my hands. She did not even bother to meet my eyes when she continued. "You are not invited. Rachel, it is nothing personal. But I cannot risk the embarrassment." Ethan nodded along, his voice firm. "It is for the best. You would not fit in with that crowd anyway." The words stung. But what burned more was how easily they cut me out of the picture. The three of us had grown up in this very house, sharing chores, blowing out birthday candles side by side. But in their minds, I was no longer family. I was a liability. I pushed back my chair and stood. The legs scraped against the floor and the sound echoed in the quiet kitchen. The check still sat on the table between us. A small white rectangle that represented every ounce of disdain they carried for me. I left it there. Lauren finally looked up. Her face calm, almost smug, as if she had accomplished something important. Ethan kept his arms crossed, satisfied with his judgment. I walked toward the doorway, my boots heavy on the floorboards, my hands clenched at my sides. At the threshold, I paused for just a second. Glancing back at them, they were already talking about guest lists and floral arrangements, as if my presence had never mattered. I turned away, stepped into the cool night, and closed the door behind me. The silence outside felt cleaner than the noise I had just left behind. The streetlights cast long shadows across the cracked sidewalk, and the air smelled faintly of cut grass. I breathed it in, letting the chill fill my lungs. For the first time that night, I allowed myself a small, bitter smile. They thought I was nothing more than a dishwasher sister. They thought $5,000 could buy me off, erase me from their perfect picture. What they did not know, what they could never have imagined, was that I was about to begin something that would take me far from this kitchen, far from their judgments, into a world where their approval meant nothing. I walked away from the house without looking back again, leaving the check, the insults, and the hollow love of my siblings on that old wooden table where family had once meant something real. The walk from that house carried me back through years I had tried to bury. My boots hit the sidewalk in steady rhythm, and with each step, my mind pulled me farther from Omaha and deeper into the desert heat of Afghanistan. 8 years in the army had carved lines into my soul that my brother and sister would never see. I had served as a military police officer, a job that demanded order in places where chaos was the only language spoken. The first time I landed in Kabul, I remember the way the air smelled of dust and diesel. The mountains jagged like broken teeth against a pale sky. I was 24, barely out of Nebraska, suddenly responsible for soldiers twice my size who looked to me for direction at checkpoints and convoy escorts. We rode Humvees down roads lined with burned-out cars, eyes always scanning for IEDs buried beneath the dirt. The fear never really left you, but you learned to ride it like a current, to act with it buzzing in your chest. There was one night outside Kandahar when the base came under fire. Mortars rained down and the ground shook under our boots. I remember dragging a wounded corporal out from behind a toppled wall while tracers lit the sky. My hands bled from shrapnel and my throat burned with smoke. But I kept moving because stopping meant death for him and maybe for me. Later, when the dust cleared, they pinned a bronze star to my chest. The ribbon sat heavy, but heavier still was the silence I carried when I came home. Lauren had smiled politely when I told her about it, but she quickly shifted the conversation to her new promotion. Ethan had laughed and asked if medals paid bills. To them, my service was nothing more than a detour, an inconvenience that had made me rougher, harder to place beside their polished lives. They never saw the faces of the children we had protected, or the terror in the eyes of villagers when gunfire erupted. They only saw my calloused hands and my plain clothes. My childhood had been the rehearsal for this disregard. Mom always fussed over Lauren, praising her perfect grades and her elegant piano recitals. Dad cheered the loudest at Ethan's football games, clapping him on the back like he was destined for Wall Street. I was the kid who brought home B's, who sat on the bench more than I played, who did chores without being asked but without earning praise either. At family gatherings, I was the extra chair at the table, the afterthought in photographs where Lauren stood in the middle and Ethan wrapped his arm around her. One afternoon in junior year of high school, I stayed after gym to put away equipment. Coach Miller, gray hair and a whistle around his neck, found me stacking cones. He asked why I never tried out for varsity basketball. I shrugged, saying it was not for me. He studied me for a moment, then said quietly, "Rachel, you are stronger than you think. Stronger than even your family gives you credit for. Do not let their blindness convince you that you are invisible." His words lodged somewhere deep. Words I carried years later, when bullets flew and when siblings sneered. Thinking back on those moments, the kitchen scene in Omaha made sense. It had always been this way. Me, fighting to be seen. Them fighting to erase me. For a long time I believed I needed their approval. That maybe if I earned enough medals or money, I could finally sit proudly at that wooden table again. But standing outside under the streetlights that night, I felt the truth settle like steady ground under my boots. I did not need their praise. I did not need Ethan's checks or Lauren's invitations. What I needed was the certainty that I could walk into the fire and come out carrying someone else's life in my arms. What I needed was to trust the strength Coach Miller had seen all those years ago. I thought of the desert winds, the endless patrols, the comrades who had not made it back. I thought of the silence after the firefight when all you could hear was your own heartbeat reminding you that you were still here. That was my measure, not the glances of siblings dressed in silk or the weight of their casual cruelty. I gripped the steering wheel of my old pickup as I pulled away from the neighborhood. Headlights cutting through the dark streets. Ahead of me stretched a life I had not yet imagined. One that would demand every ounce of grit I had cultivated in war zones and childhood shadows alike. The past had done its damage, but I would not chain myself to it any longer. I whispered to the empty cab, "Enough." Then I pressed my foot down and let the road carry me forward, away from their judgments, into the unknown that already felt more like home than the house I had just left behind. The first time I stepped behind the counter of the diner off Interstate 80 in western Nebraska, the grease in the air clung to my skin like a second layer. Neon lights buzzed above cracked vinyl booths, and the scent of fried onions and burnt coffee never really left. No matter how often we scrubbed, to the truckers who pulled in after midnight, I was nobody more than a waitress with tired eyes and calloused hands. That was the point. I wore a faded apron with my name stitched in cursive, Rachel, though some customers never bothered to read it. They just whistled for service or snapped their fingers like I was part of the furniture. I carried plates of chicken fried steak, refilled mugs with bottomless coffee, and scrubbed dishes until my knuckles turned raw. They saw a dishwasher sister, someone small and forgettable. What they never saw was the badge locked away in a safety box miles from here, or the wire sewn into the hem of my jacket. It was cover work, the kind you lived so deeply that sometimes you forgot who you were beneath it. Nights blurred into mornings under fluorescent light, the clatter of silverware masking the quiet exchanges I waited for. I had been planted here because the highway traffic carried more than freight. Deals were made in parking lots. Whispers of routes and drop points traded over pie and coffee. My job was to blend in, to become part of the landscape so that when the right man sat at the counter, he would not notice the way I leaned closer. Most nights the words cut more than the grease did. One trucker sneered when I dropped a plate too loudly, muttering that girls like me never made it past the sink. Another laughed with his buddies, asking if I gave out numbers with milkshakes. I swallowed it down with a tight smile, my eyes on the coffee pot. In my head I replayed firefights and commands, the moments I had earned a Bronze Star. I reminded myself I was here on a mission bigger than their cruelty. But the sting of their dismissals still found a place beneath my ribs. One Tuesday, while the rain streaked the diner windows, I saw him. Victor Kane. Known in files as a mid-level player in a trafficking network stretching from Oklahoma to the Dakotas, he had the look of someone who thought the world belonged to him. Leather jacket, rings on his fingers, and the kind of smirk that dared you to challenge it. He slid into a booth, ordered black coffee, and eyed the room like he owned it. I moved with the same practiced shuffle, pad in hand, pencil tucked behind my ear. When I set the cup down, his gaze lingered on me longer than it should have, not in the way men usually looked, but calculating, as if measuring whether I was worth a second thought. I let the silence stretch, wiped the table beside him, and then leaned closer, whispering just loud enough. Place like this, you hear things, sometimes more than you want to. He tilted his head, a half smile curving his lips. You seem smarter than the rest of these folks. What's your angle? I shrugged. Played the part of a woman tired of small-town life, hungry for something larger. Maybe I just like listening. People around here think I am invisible. You'd be surprised what slips when nobody is paying attention. His laugh was low and rough, but his eyes stayed sharp. He stirred sugar into his coffee, though he had asked for none. That was when I knew he was testing me. I poured him a refill without being asked, steadied my hand against the pot. Before he could say more, the bell over the door jingled. A man in a denim jacket and baseball cap walked in. Shaking off rain, he looked like any other local. But I knew the shoulders, the stride. David Torres slid onto a stool at the counter and gave me a nod that no one else noticed. To everyone else he was just another drifter ordering meatloaf. To me he was a lifeline. A reminder that, beneath the grease and insults, I was still Rachel Morgan. Deputy U.S. Marshal. I slipped behind the counter, setting down a slice of pie in front of him. His fingers brushed mine. Pressing a folded napkin into my palm, I tucked it away without breaking stride, moving to the sink to rinse plates. Later, in the back room with the hum of a freezer masking our words, I unfolded it. Route shift Thursday. Kane transporting east. Contact confirmed. The paper trembled slightly in my hand. Not from fear, but from the rush that came every time a piece clicked into place. David met my eyes, speaking low. You are getting close. Too close, maybe. Be careful. Morgan, I nodded, sliding the napkin into the trash where grease stains would swallow it. That was the rule. Nothing stayed. Nothing lingered. When I walked back onto the floor, Victor Kane was watching me. His gaze was sharp, but there was a flicker of trust now. Or at least curiosity. He tapped his ring against the coffee cup and said, "Place like this. Nobody knows anything. But you. You might be different." I leaned on the counter, kept my voice casual. "Depends on what you're asking." He smirked, then pulled a crumpled receipt from his pocket and scribbled a number on the back. He slid it toward me with 2 fingers. Call this. Tell them Kane said you're solid. They will have something for you. If you want to make real money. I tucked the receipt into my apron. My hands steady, though my chest tightened. This was the crack we had waited months for. The first thread leading deeper into the web. The rain had stopped outside. The sound replaced by the low rumble of engines on the highway. Victor finished his coffee, tossed bills on the table, and walked out into the night like he had never been there. The bell above the door stilled, and the diner returned to the rhythm of clattering forks and tired conversations. I washed dishes until my knuckles ached, hot water stinging the cuts on my hands. But inside I felt the weight shift. For the first time, Victor Kane had opened a door, and I was already halfway through it. The weeks that followed blurred into one another. Long nights of burnt coffee and whispered exchanges. Each shift drawing me deeper into the current I had stepped into. By the summer of 2020, I was no longer just a waitress along Interstate 80. I was the eyes and ears of an investigation stretching across 5 states. And every breath I took had to sound ordinary. Victor Kane's number opened doors I had no business standing in. Back rooms of gas stations where deals were carved on grease-stained tables. Motel parking lots where cash changed hands under flickering lights. My cover became a second skin. They thought I was a woman with nothing left. A dishwasher surviving on tips and scraps. Desperate enough to look the other way if the money was right. That was exactly what they wanted. And exactly what I gave them. There were nights the danger pressed so close I could taste it. Once, outside a storage unit on the edge of Des Moines, a man twice my size shoved me against a wall. His breath hot with whiskey. He pressed a knife against my ribs, asking why Kane trusted me. I steadied my voice, forced a laugh, and said if Kane thought I was solid, maybe he should too. For a moment, I thought I had misplayed it. That he would bury the blade and leave me bleeding in the gravel. Instead, he grunted, slid the knife back into his belt, and muttered that I was lucky. I went home that night to my shabby apartment, hands shaking as I locked the door. But by dawn, I was back at the diner. Apéritif, coffee pot in hand. That was the rhythm. Fear at night, pretending in the morning. The mission threading both together. Not all of us walked away unscarred. David Torres stayed close, sometimes shadowing from across the lot, sometimes slipping me coded notes on receipts. One night in late 2021, a run went bad in a warehouse outside Kansas City. Shots cracked through the air as a shipment was intercepted. David caught a round in his shoulder as he covered my retreat. I dragged him behind a stack of crates, pressing my hand against the wound while sirens wailed in the distance. He gritted his teeth, whispering through the pain, "You stay in it, Morgan. Do not blow your cover." That order weighed heavier than the blood soaking through my fingers. Months passed, and I kept walking the razor's edge. The faces I met blurred into one another. Dealers, courriers, men who treated human lives as if they were merchandise. But one face stayed with me. She could not have been more than 17. They called her Anna. I first saw her in the back of a truck behind the diner. Her wrists bound, eyes hollow, with a kind of fear that never belonged in someone so young. One of Kane's men barked at her to keep quiet as they moved her to another vehicle. Our eyes met for only a second. But in that second, I saw recognition. She knew I was not like them. Later that night, when I slipped her a piece of cornbread wrapped in napkin, her hands shook so hard she almost dropped it. She whispered her name. Anna Lee. From Wichita. Taken months ago. Her voice cracked when she asked me if anyone was coming. I lowered my tone. Steady. Calm. Promising in a way only I could. I will get you out. You have my word. It was reckless to say it. But I could not stop myself. Those words became an oath I carried in every step afterward. By early 2022, Kane began testing me with bigger roles. I drove cars across county lines. We handed off packages I never opened. Carried envelopes thick with cash to men with dead eyes. Each task was a deeper cut into the role I played. And each time I wondered if they could smell the truth beneath my skin. Suspicion did come, in the winter of 2022. During a run near Sioux Falls. A man named Riker leaned close as I lit his cigarette. His eyes were sharp. His voice low enough, only I could hear. You do not move like a waitress. Who taught you to scan rooms like that? The flame trembled at the tip of my lighter. But I kept my hand steady. I laughed. Said, maybe years of dealing with drunks made me cautious. He did not smile. He blew smoke in my face. Div his hand brushing the edge of my jacket as if searching for wires. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to the pressure of his hand and the pounding of my heart. Then Kane shouted from across the lot. Telling Riker to leave me alone. She is with me. He barked. The hand slipped away. The suspicion not erased, but postponed. That night, I sat awake in my apartment staring at the ceiling fan spinning shadows across the walls. One slip, and it would be over. I thought of David's blood on my hands. Of Anna's terrified eyes. Of every nameless victim waiting for someone to notice. I thought of the siblings who dismissed me as nothing. And how little they knew of the nights I walked between life and death. 3 years stretched long. Each day heavier than the last. But I stayed. I stayed because of Anna. Because of the promises I had made silently to the ones who could not speak. I stayed because when you have walked through fire before, you learn to keep walking, even when the flames lick higher. And still, in the quiet hours when I stripped off the apron and scrubbed the stink of fryer oil from my skin, I felt the question pressing against me. How long before suspicion turned to certainty? Before the knife pressed against my ribs finally broke skin. March of 2023 arrived with a chill that cut through Nebraska and settled in my bones. I had been under so long that every day felt borrowed. Every smile rehearsed. Every silence calculated. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. David's voice crackled through the burner phone. I kept hidden beneath a loose tile in my apartment. It is time. Morgan. We are pulling the trigger. The next 48 hours blurred into a storm of movement. Teams across 5 states mobilized. Unmarked vans rolling down highways. Warrants signed and ready. My role was simple but dangerous. I had to stay close to Kane until the hammer fell. One wrong move and I would vanish with the same silence as so many victims before me. That Friday night I sat in the back room of the diner. Apron still tied around my waist. When headlights flooded the parking lot. Radios whispered in my earpiece. Go. Now. Outside. The quiet Nebraska town exploded with sirens and boots pounding pavement. I watched through the blinds as agents swarmed Kane's car. Weapons raised. Voice sharp, he barely had time to curse before they dragged him out. Face pressed against cold metal. The takedown spread like fire. In Des Moines. In Wichita. In Kansas City. Doors splintered under battering rams. 21 arrests across 5 states. Each name one more thread severed from the network that had strangled so many. I had lived inside their world for almost 3 years. And now it was unraveling in real time. When it was finally over, I sat on the curb outside the diner, the neon lights flickering above me, hands trembling, not from fear, but release. David came up, his shoulder still carrying the scar of the night he had been shot. His eyes steady. He dropped into a crouch beside me, pulling off his cap. "Pack your real clothes. Morgan, you are going home." The words sank deep, heavier than any order I had ever received. Home. For so long, that word had meant a cover apartment with peeling wallpaper. A diner that reeked of fryer grease. A name that was not fully mine. Now it meant freedom. Though I was not sure I remembered how to live it. News outlets swarmed within hours. The bust had been too large. Too visible to stay quiet. By dawn, every station in the Midwest carried the headlines. Major human trafficking ring dismantled. 56 victims freed. 15 of them children. I watched on a motel television as anchors repeated the numbers. Their voices brisk and practiced. They spoke of federal coordination, of bravery, of justice. My name was never mentioned. It never would be. That was the price of undercover work. But then the screen shifted. Footage played of a young girl stepping into her mother's arms outside a recovery shelter in Wichita. Her dark hair fell loose over her shoulders, and her face crumpled with tears that spoke more than words ever could. The caption read, "Anna Lee, age 17. Reunited with family." I leaned forward, my heart slamming against my ribs. It was her. The girl in the back of the truck. The girl I had promised freedom. She clung to her mother like she would never let go. Her shoulders shaking. Her voice muffled against her mother's coat. I closed my eyes and heard her whisper again in that parking lot, asking if anyone was coming. I had told her yes. Now, watching her held tight in the arms of the people who loved her, I knew that promise had been kept. Tears burned at the corners of my eyes. Surprising me, I had built walls high and thick during those years. But in that moment, they cracked. All the long nights, the close calls, the knife against my ribs, the blood on David's shirt. All of it had been for this, for Anna. And for the others whose names the reporters read off like statistics, but who were breathing free air for the first time in years. Later that day, I stood in a sterile briefing room with my team. The walls were bare. The table cluttered with reports and empty coffee cups. The director shook my hand. His grip firm. "Exceptional work, Marshall. You did what few could." My chest tightened at his words. But I only nodded. Praise felt strange after years of insults and suspicion. When the meeting broke, David clapped me on the back. He grinned. "Tired but alive. You kept your promise," he said. Not just to Anna. To all of them. That night I packed a duffel bag with clothes I had not worn in 3 years. Real clothes that did not smell of grease or carry pockets sewn with wires. I folded the uniform of a life that had been both shield and prison, tucking it into the bottom of the bag as if burying it. As I zipped it shut, silence filled the room. Not the silence of fear. Not the silence of holding my breath while men with knives circled too close. But the silence of an ending. Outside, traffic hummed on the interstate. ordinary and unremarkable. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the duffel bag and the badge on the dresser that once again belonged to me. Tomorrow I would leave this place. Tomorrow I would step back into a world that thought I had been nothing more than a dishwasher. While, in truth, I had walked in shadows they could not imagine. The weight in my chest eased as I thought of Anna's face on that television, pressed against her mother's shoulder. Alive and free. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe without watching my back. The mission was over, and my promise had been kept. The morning after the takedown, I sat on the edge of a motel bed with sunlight creeping through cheap curtains. My duffel bag was packed, the badge and service weapon inside. And for the first time in 3 years, I had no orders waiting. My phone buzzed against the nightstand, and when I picked it up, I saw an old text thread from Ethan. Scrolling back, I found it. A message sent nearly a year before. The night we had sat in that kitchen when he and Lauren told me I was not welcome. It was short. Just a date and a location. April 15th. Hudson Riverside Country Club, New York. His words had been smug even in print. Lauren's big day. Do not cause trouble. I stared at the screen. The words like a ghost pulled from the past. The wedding was weeks away. I could have deleted the message and let it fade into memory. I could have taken my leave and vanished. Maybe drive south until I hit the Gulf and lose myself on a stretch of quiet beach where nobody knew my name. That choice whispered to me, promising rest. Anonymité. The kind of peace I had not tasted since my 20s. But another whisper pressed harder. The image of Lauren across that table. Perfectly polished nails pointing at my stained shirt. The sound of Ethan's voice calling me a dishwasher sister while he pushed a $5,000 check across the wood. They had carved me out of their lives like a flaw they wanted hidden. The wedding was their showcase. Their moment to polish the Morgan name before the wealth and prestige of the Whitmore family. And they thought I would stay in the shadows. I turned off the phone and sat in silence. I did not need their approval. I had already proven more than they would ever understand. Still, the thought of standing in that country club, not as a ghost but as myself, pulled at me. Not to ruin their day. Not even for revenge. Simply to be seen for who I was. That night I found myself scrolling through social media. Ethan's face filled the screen. Smiling in tailored suits. Holding wine glasses on rooftops. Posting captions about building legacies and living without limits. But beneath the staged photos there were cracks. A colleague of mine from the marshal's office in Chicago had once mentioned Ethan's name when looking into debt records. Unpaid credit lines. Gambling losses tucked behind shell companies. Late fees stacking like bricks. He wore the mask of a man climbing higher. But behind it, he was drowning. I watched a video he had posted a week earlier. Standing in front of a leased Mercedes. Telling his followers about success and persistence. I wondered if his new in-laws knew how fragile his empire really was. It almost made me pity him. Almost. I opened the closet in my apartment. One I had barely touched during my cover years. Hanging there in a garment bag was the dress uniform I had not worn since training. Navy blue. Pressed fabric. Polished buttons that caught the light. The 5-pointed star of the United States Marshal Service gleamed on the badge clipped to the chest. My ribbon rack told a story in colors most people never bothered to ask about. Bronze Star. Meritorious Service. Joint Service Commendation. Each one was a piece of history Lauren and Ethan had dismissed as the military thing. I ran my fingers over the fabric and felt a strange calm settle inside me. I did not need to scream. Did not need to fight. All I had to do was show up. Let the truth speak without a word of defense. The next day, David called to check in. His voice was lighter now that the case had wrapped. But he still carried the edge of a man who had seen too much. "What are you going to do now?" "Morgan. Vacation. Disappear for a while. Maybe," I said. "Or maybe I will go to a wedding." He laughed. The sound rough but real. "Just do not start a fight in uniform." I smiled even though he could not see it. "I will not need to." That evening, I laid the uniform across the bed and polished the shoes until they reflected the lamplight. I checked the badge case. The photo ID. The name engraved in black letters. It felt heavier than I remembered. But maybe that was only because of the years I had lived without it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I stood at the window, looking out at the highway stretching east. Beyond those miles lay New York. The Hudson River. The Riverside Country Club filled with marble floors and chandeliers. Beyond it stood Lauren in her white gown. Ethan pretending his debts were invisible. The Whitmore family expecting perfection. My duffel was ready by the door. For the first time in years, I was not walking into danger. I was walking into something quieter but sharper. The chance to stand in the light of their carefully built world and let them see what they had thrown away. I drew the curtains closed and switched off the lamp. The room sinking into darkness. Tomorrow, I would begin the drive east. Tomorrow, I would carry myself not as the dishwasher sister, but as Deputy United States Marshal Rachel Morgan. The drive east stretched over 2 days. The hum of the tires against asphalt giving me too much time to think. My government-issued Ford Explorer carried me past flat farmland, through crowded toll booths, and into the maze of highways feeding New York. By the time the Hudson River glimmered in the distance, my chest was tight with a mixture of calm determination and something close to dread. The Riverside Country Club rose like a monument to wealth. Its gates flanked by tall hedges trimmed into perfect lines. Marble pillars gleamed in the morning sun, and valets in tailored uniforms darted between German sedans and black SUVs. I pulled up to the entrance where a guard in a navy blazer stood with a clipboard. His eyes swept over my vehicle, pausing at the government plates. "Invitation." "Mom," he said, though his tone softened when he saw the polished uniform I wore. I reached for my phone, scrolling quickly to the text Ethan had sent long ago. The screen glowed with his words. April 15th. Hudson Riverside Country Club. Lauren's big day. Do not cause trouble. I tilted it toward the guard. He squinted, checked the clipboard, and nodded. Your name is still on the list. You are cleared. The gate swung open, and the Explorer rolled forward onto a drive lined with cherry blossoms just beginning to bloom. I parked near the far edge of the lot, away from the clusters of luxury cars, and stepped out. The sound of string instruments floated faintly from the courtyard. My shoes clicked against the stone as I walked toward the grand double doors. Every eye that passed, flickering curiously at the ribbons on my chest. Inside, chandeliers rained light down on polished marble floors. Waiters moved gracefully with trays of champagne, weaving between guests dressed in gowns and tuxedos. I blended into none of it. Yet, I felt no urge to shrink. My uniform carried its own weight, one that did not require approval from these people. Near the reception hall, I paused, watching Lauren's new family mingle. The Whitmores carried themselves with the quiet arrogance of old money. Margaret, The matriarch waved her diamonded hand as she discussed property values in Connecticut. A younger uncle in a navy suit bragged about vacation homes on Martha's Vineyard. Their voices blended into a chorus of numbers and acquisitions. Conversations meant more for display than for connection. I let their words wash over me. For years, I had lived among men who bartered human lives like cattle. And somehow this did not sound so different. The stakes were polished, legal, adorned with champagne instead of blood. But the hunger in their voices rang familiar. Across the room, I spotted Ethan. He stood with a small group of men near the bar, a glass of whiskey in his hand. His tie loosened just enough to suggest confidence. His laugh was loud, practiced, but his eyes betrayed him. When they swept the room and landed on me, the color drained from his face. For a moment we held each other's gaze. He blinked quickly, looked away, and turned back to his companions with a forced chuckle. His shoulders stiffened, his hand tightening around the glass until his knuckles whitened. He did not come over. He did not even acknowledge me. The avoidance spoke louder than any words. I wondered if the weight of his debts, hidden under all that silk and liquor, had grown too heavy for him to carry. I stayed where I was, leaning slightly against a column, content to let his discomfort speak for itself. He had once offered me $5,000 as if it were charity. Yet now he looked like a man who would sell pieces of himself for the same sum. The music shifted. A hush fell over the crowd as the ceremony prepared to begin. Ushers guided guests into the main hall where rows of white chairs lined an aisle draped in roses. I followed quietly, choosing a seat near the back, far from the clusters of chatter. My presence drew glances, whispers fluttering among guests who were unsure what to make of the woman in uniform seated alone. I ignored them. The air thickened with anticipation as the first notes of the wedding march swelled. Heads turned toward the grand doors at the back of the hall. And then Lauren appeared. She stepped into the room on her father-in-law's arm, her gown shimmering with sequins that caught every shard of light. Her veil trailed like mist across the carpet. And her smile was wide, practiced, perfect. Gasps of admiration rippled through the crowd. She looked radiant, intouchable, the star of the day she had so carefully curated. I sat in the back row, my hands folded, my face calm. Around me, people rose to their feet in awe. Phones lifted discreetly to capture the moment. I simply watched, the weight of years pressing against my chest. Knowing what none of them did, she had erased me from her perfect picture. Yet here I was, watching her walk down the aisle as if nothing could touch her. The music swelled louder, filling the vaulted ceiling with echoes of triumph. Lauren moved step by step toward her future, her smile locked in place. From the back row, I stayed silent, watching her every movement, waiting for the moment when the curtain of her performance would begin to tear. The applause faded as the ceremony gave way to clinking glasses and the shuffle of chairs. Guests spilled into the reception hall, their laughter swelling under chandeliers heavy with crystal. A jazz quartet struck up near the stage, violins weaving through the hum of conversations about stock portfolios and vacation villas. I drifted toward the bar, the uniform pressed against my shoulders like armor, and ordered a club soda. I wanted my head clear, everywhere I looked. Lauren thrived in the glow of attention. She moved effortlessly between groups, her sequined gown shimmering like it had been spun from starlight, her veil pinned neatly, as though even gravity obeyed her. Charles stood proudly beside her, shaking hands, introducing her as though she were a jewel he had discovered. She leaned into him, laughing at the right moments, tilting her head in practiced elegance. I stayed in the corner, silent, studying the performance. The room was full of men who spoke with clipped voices about market trends, women who compared the cut of their diamonds, and in-laws who measured worth by square footage and surnames. It was a play. Every line rehearsed, every smile choreographed. A waiter passed with champagne. I lifted the glass, let it touch my lips, and set it down untouched. The uniform on my back felt heavier in this room than it ever had in a combat zone. Here, its weight was not danger, but contrast. I belonged to a world none of them wanted to imagine. That was when I caught Lauren's voice. It rose above the chatter like a bell. Unmistakable. She stood with Margaret near the French doors, flanked by two of Charles's uncles. Margaret, in her pearls and navy silk, nodded as Lauren spoke, her smile poised and tight. I moved closer, the words sharpening as I closed the distance. One of the uncles asked if all her family had come. His tone was light, polite curiosity. Lauren's expression flickered for just a second before she smoothed it back into place. Then she laughed. A sound too high, too brittle. She washes dishes for a living. Embarrassing. Really? The words landed like glass shattering inside me. Margaret's lips twitched in sympathy, the kind reserved for gossip passed as fact. One uncle furrowed his brow, lowering his voice. Military. I heard something. Lauren shook her head quickly. Dismissive. Just a dead-end job after she left the service. Nothing worth mentioning. My grip tightened around the rim of the glass in my hand until water slid down over my knuckles. The words pressed hot against my chest. I had endured them before, years ago in that kitchen. But hearing them now, spoken so easily to strangers who would never know the truth, pulled something raw from inside me. I set the glass back on the counter with deliberate calm. My heartbeat steadied, every instinct drilled into me from years of service rising to the surface. When you are under fire, you move with precision, not impulse. I straightened my shoulders and stepped forward. The marble floor carried the sound of my shoes. Small, but steady. A hush crept into the circle as I approached, curiosity rippling outward. Lauren turned at the last second, then her smile faltering when her eyes landed on me. For a heartbeat, she froze, taking in the sight of the uniform, the polished badge gleaming in the light, the rows of ribbons pinned neatly across my chest. I stopped just inside their circle, meeting her eyes without hesitation. My voice carried clear but even, not raised, not strained. Lauren, you told them I wash dishes. Let me tell them what I really do. The silence that followed was thick. A silence that pulled every wandering eye in the room toward us. Margaret blinked, confusion cutting through her composure. The uncles exchanged glances, caught between politeness and intrigue. Lauren's face drained of color, her lips parting without words. I held her gaze, steady, unflinching. Years undercover had taught me patience in silence, the power of stillness. Here, it was not a weapon against criminals, but against lies. The band continued to play, but softer now, the music sounding distant against the tension that filled the space around us. Guests nearby shifted, their conversations faltering as they noticed the standoff at the edge of the French doors. Lauren tried to laugh, but it caught in her throat. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, her eyes darting toward Margaret as if searching for support. Margaret only stared, her brows arched, her pearls rising and falling with each shallow breath. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing on her. Not on me. For 3 years I had carried the weight of grease-stained aprons, suspicion, and knives against my ribs. Tonight, the burden shifted. Her performance cracked. The first tear in the fabric of perfection she had stitched so carefully. I said nothing more. Not yet. The truth was still inside me, waiting for the right breath, in the right second to shatter the illusion she had wrapped herself in. The air between us trembled, filled with the unspoken, with the questions on the lips of every onlooker. My hands rested at my sides, calm, my posture unyielding. Across from me, Lauren's chest rose and fell too quickly, her eyes unable to hold mine for more than a second at a time. It was no longer about the lies she told in that kitchen years ago, or the $5,000 check Ethan had slid across the table. It was about the life I had lived in the shadows. The years of sacrifice no one here could fathom, and the promise that I would not let them erase me again. The room held its breath as if the chandeliers themselves leaned down to listen, and in that silence, I prepared to speak the words that would tear her curtain wide open. I drew in a slow breath, steadying my voice so that not a trace of doubt could be heard when the words left my mouth. I am Deputy United States Marshal Rachel Morgan, Special Operations Group. The declaration dropped into the space like a weight no one had expected. Glasses hovered midair. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Conversations evaporated into silence. Margaret's painted smile faltered, her eyes darting to Lauren, searching for explanation. One of Charles's uncles leaned back slightly, confusion shadowing his face, while the other stared openly at the ribbons across my chest, as if trying to interpret the language they spoke. Lauren stood frozen, the shine of her sequined gown suddenly too bright under the chandeliers. Her lips parted, but she did not speak. For the first time that evening, her performance failed her. I did not rush. Years undercover had taught me patience, the value of each measured beat. When I spoke again, my words were deliberate, my tone calm but undeniable. For 3 years, I lived under a name and a life that were not mine. I worked undercover to infiltrate a trafficking network that stretched across 5 states. 3 weeks ago, the operation ended. 21 suspects were arrested. 56 victims were freed. 15 of them were children. A collective murmur spread through the guests gathered around us, disbelief colliding with curiosity. The hum of the quartet continued in the background, but it sounded faint now. A soundtrack to something raw and unpolished. People leaned closer, their eyes flicking from Lauren to me and back again. I reached into my jacket with deliberate calm and withdrew the leather case I had carried through deserts and cities. The same one I had guarded when knives pressed too close. With a flick, it opened, revealing the 5-pointed star of the Marshal's Service and the photo ID beneath. My name, my face, my authority engraved in black letters. I held it steady for all to see. This is who I am. I snapped it shut and let it rest at my side. My other hand rose slightly to the ribbons on my chest. These are the honors I earned in service. Bronze Star, Medal of Valor, commendations that came with scars you cannot see from where you stand. The silence thickened. People who had been politely avoiding me earlier now stared outright. Recognition dawning. They knew these were not trinkets or costumes. They knew they were looking at someone who had lived in a different world. One of danger and sacrifice. Far removed from the polished wealth of this club. From across the room, a new voice cut through. Deep and authoritative. I read about that case. Judge Richard Whitmore stepped forward. His cane tapping against the marble as he approached. His lined face carried the weight of decades spent on the bench, sifting truth from lies. And now his sharp eyes were fixed on me. He gave a slow nod. His voice clear enough to reach every ear. Kansas City. Wichita. Des Moines. That was you. I inclined my head slightly. Yes. See. The respect in his eyes was unmistakable. Your work saved lives, he said. And the words rang out like a gavel striking wood. The effect rippled through the crowd immediately. Heads turned. Whispers rose. But they no longer carried disdain. Admiration softened faces. Glasses lifted slightly in quiet recognition. A cousin near the back raised his phone, lowering it quickly when Margaret shot him a look. But the moment had already shifted. Lauren swayed slightly, her hand clutching the stem of her champagne glass too tightly. Her face, once radiant with triumph, had drained of color. She had told them I washed dishes. She had spoken of me as a shame. And now, her father-in-law, a retired federal judge, publicly acknowledged me as a woman whose work dismantled one of the largest trafficking networks in recent years. Margaret cleared her throat, adjusting the strand of pearls at her neck. She offered a strained smile, but her composure cracked at the edges. The uncles exchanged murmurs about bravery, one muttering that he remembered the news coverage. A guest I had never met raised his glass toward me in a small salute. I held Lauren's gaze, calm and unyielding. I had not needed to argue, had not needed to lift my voice. Her own words had undone her. The insult she had flung so casually now circled back and clung to her, unraveling the careful curtain she had stitched to impress these people. She opened her mouth, perhaps to deny, perhaps to spin, but nothing came. Her jaw trembled, her eyes flashing with the desperation of someone who had lost control of the stage she had built. Her smile collapsed into something hollow, and she looked away first. I let the silence linger. Silence has weight when you know how to use it. In my years undercover, I had learned the power of a pause, the way it forces the other side to fill it. Tonight, the pause worked differently. It forced Lauren to stand in the wreckage of her own lies. I did not need to list every scar, every night of fear, every promise whispered to girls like Anna Lee in the backs of trucks. I did not need to tell them what it was like to carry a man bleeding out of a firefight or to keep breathing when a knife grazed my ribs. The truth was here in my presence, in the badge and ribbons that glinted beneath the chandeliers around us. The music swelled again as if trying to reclaim the room. But it was too late. The tide had turned. The reception no longer revolved around Lauren's perfect performance. It revolved around the truth she had tried to bury. I lowered my hand from the ribbons, letting it fall back to my side. My face stayed steady, unreadable, the way it always had when I stood in front of men, far more dangerous than the ones here tonight. Lauren's hand shook so badly that the champagne in her glass spilled onto her gown, darkening the sequins where it soaked through. Gasps rippled quietly among the guests. But no one stepped forward to help her. Not even Charles. He stood stiffly at her side, his eyes fixed on me with something between shock and respect. The irony was sharp enough to taste. She had introduced herself to this world by cutting me down, by presenting me as a shame. And in the same room, in the same breath, her lie had been split open, exposing her not as a star, but as a woman desperate to climb on someone else's back. I said nothing more. I did not need to. The chandelier light glinted off the badge at my side, and the room itself bore witness. Lauren's curtain had torn wide open, and there was no stitching it back together. Margaret was the first to stir. Then her carefully composed mask, slipping as she clasped her pearls like they might steady her. Her voice wavered, just above a whisper, yet clear enough for everyone nearby to hear. Deputy Marshal Morgan. Forgive me. I had no idea. Her words trembled with embarrassment, her gaze flickering from me to Lauren, as though searching for confirmation, or perhaps a way out of the shame that had just settled over her family. When no reassurance came, she swallowed hard and tried again. The things I repeated about you, the assumptions I made, they were wrong. I am sorry. Charles stood beside his bride, stiff as a statue. His hand hovered near Lauren's arm but did not rest there. His mouth opened like he might speak, but whatever words he had faltered before they could form. He looked from his mother to me, his eyes uncertain, as if the foundation he had believed in for months had just cracked underfoot. Then Ethan's voice sliced through the silence. It was sharp, defensive, carrying that familiar arrogance I had grown up under. You failed out of the military, didn't you? That is what happened. You could not make it. So you built this story to cover it up. Gasps rippled through the circle. Heads turned toward him, some in disbelief, some in discomfort. I straightened slowly, keeping my voice calm and deliberate. No, Ethan, I did not fail out. I served 8 years in the United States Army Military Police, 2 tours in Afghanistan, Bronze Star for actions under enemy fire. I stepped forward just enough for the light to catch the ribbons on my chest. After my service ended, I was recruited directly into the U.S. Marshal's Service. For 3 years I worked undercover, living a life none of you could have survived, dismantling a trafficking network that spanned across 5 states. 21 arrests, 56 lives saved. 15 of those were children. The crowd murmured again, this time with notes of admiration. I let the weight of my words linger. Ethan's bravado wavered, his jaw tightening as he looked from my uniform to the faces around us. Realizing he had no audience left to impress, the tap of a cane against marble cut through the whispers. Judge Richard Whitmore stepped closer, his presence commanding attention even in a hall filled with wealth and power. His lined face carried the gravity of years spent weighing evidence and truth. I have read those reports, he said firmly. Kansas City, Wichita, Des Moines. It was in every legal brief for weeks. He turned his sharp gaze on Ethan. What your sister accomplished is beyond dispute. It is fact, documented in the federal record. Ethan froze, caught like a man stripped of his last defense. His mouth opened, but no sound came. His shoulders hunched as his eyes dropped to the floor, and the whiskey glass in his hand trembled. Margaret adjusted her pearls again, but her tone had shifted. No longer defensive. It was low and measured. I was wrong to echo what I heard, wrong to believe it without question. Her glance at Lauren was fleeting but pointed. carrying disappointment sharper than any rebuke. Around us, guests who had once looked at me with disinterest now regarded me differently. Some nodded subtly in acknowledgement. Others leaned toward their neighbors to whisper about courage and service. A cousin lifted his glass quietly in my direction, and another guest murmured about bravery under fire. Charles finally found his voice, though it came low and uncertain. You saved people." His eyes met mine, searching for something beyond medals and titles. I gave him a single nod. Ethan tried once more, his tone weaker, almost pleading. "You must have exaggerated, Rachel. That cannot all be true." Before I could respond, Judge Whitmore's voice rang out again, final and decisive. "I assure you, it is true. Her work saved lives." His gaze swept the room, making sure no one doubted what had been said. The matter was closed more firmly than with any gavel. Ethan's face burned red. His lips pressed tight as he turned slightly away. Shoulders slumped. He could not meet my eyes, nor the eyes of the in-laws he had so desperately wanted to impress. I let the silence hold, my eyes moving slowly across the faces gathered under the chandeliers. For years, I had been invisible in my own family, dismissed as unworthy. Now the truth stood in the open. Indéniable. Witnessed by everyone Lauren had tried so hard to impress. Lauren shifted beside Charles, her champagne glass trembling in her hand. A dark stain spread where the liquid spilled against her gown, sparkling sequins dulled by the wet. Gasps stirred among nearby guests, but no one stepped forward to help her, not even her new husband. I stayed steady, my badge glinting faintly under the light. I did not raise my voice, did not need to. The truth itself had spoken louder than any insult, and Ethan, for all his bluster, stood silent, his eyes on the floor, with nothing left to say. Lauren's voice broke the tension before anyone else could move. Her hand clutched the edge of the table beside her, the champagne glass abandoned on the floor where it had tipped over. Tears spilled freely, cutting through the layers of makeup she had so carefully applied that morning. She turned toward me, trembling, her words tumbling out in a rush. "Rachel, I am sorry." Her voice cracked, faltering under the weight of eyes that refused to look away. "I should never have treated you the way I did. I was ashamed of what people might think, and I let pride turn into cruelty. I wanted so badly to impress them that I forgot about you." Her shoulders sagged, her perfect gown clinging damp to her waist, where the champagne had stained it. For the first time since childhood, she looked small in front of me, not radiant or untouchable, just a woman trapped by her own lies. The room stayed hushed. Guests exchanged awkward glances, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line, and Charles stared straight ahead, unsure whether to console his new wife or keep his distance. Ethan edged closer then, his expression drawn, the cocky tilt of his chin gone. His voice was lower, almost hoarse. "I should say something too." He hesitated, glancing down before meeting my eyes. "I have debts, Rachel. More than I can admit out loud here. And all that time I mocked you. I told myself you were the weak one." He exhaled slowly, his hand tightening around the empty glass he held. "But it turns out I was the one drowning. I am sorry for looking down on you, for treating you like you were less His admission hung heavy in the air. The people around him shifted again, their judgment now cutting toward him with sharp edges. For years he had been the one boasting about success, dressing himself in expensive suits, laughing at my supposed failures. And now, under these chandeliers, he admitted what he had hidden. I let the silence linger before I answered. My voice came steady, firm but not unkind. I do not need your approval anymore. I never did. But I hope you both have learned what it costs to measure people by status and appearance. Lauren's sobs keyed, though tears still streaked her face. Ethan lowered his eyes again, his jaw set tight, unable to respond. The Whitmore family looked on, their discomfort clear. Margaret's expression was strained, as though she wanted to step in but could not find the words. Judge Richard stood a few feet back, his gaze steady, giving no rescue to Lauren's pride. The in-laws exchanged glances that spoke louder than anything they might say aloud. They saw the cracks. They saw the desperation beneath her elegance. And now they saw me. Not as the shadow Lauren painted, but as the sister she could never erase. Charles finally cleared his throat. His voice was quiet, uncertain, as he gestured toward me. This is my wife's sister, Deputy United States Marshal Rachel Morgan. His words were meant as an introduction, but they came out more like an admission, an acknowledgement forced into the open. The labels settled into the room. Half pride, half shame. Guests turned toward me, some offering nods of respect, others murmuring about bravery. A few lifted glasses in tentative toasts, caught between honoring the truth and sympathizing with the bride who now stood bare in front of them. I stayed where I was, calm, the badge at my side glinting faintly in the chandelier light. For the first time in years, I was not invisible. I was not the forgotten sibling or the embarrassment to be hidden away. I was seen, introduced, and acknowledged for who I was. Lauren dabbed at her cheeks with the corner of a napkin, her hands trembling. Ethan shifted back toward the bar, his shoulders hunched, unwilling to meet the eyes that followed him. Around us, the music resumed faintly, though no one truly listened. The air in the reception hall carried a new weight, one that clung to every conversation that dared to start again. For a brief moment, I let myself take it in. The chandeliers glowed brighter. The marble gleamed beneath polished shoes. And the crowd that had once dismissed me now stood divided between respect and unease. I had not planned this confrontation, had not come here to claim vengeance, yet the truth had unfolded anyway. Sharp and undeniable. I remained only a short while longer. Long enough to see guests introduced to me by name. Long enough to hear my title spoken aloud with reverence in a room where it had never been meant to exist. Sister of the bride. Deputy Marshal. The words hung in the air, carrying both pride and discomfort. And I let them stay there without correcting a thing. I walked out of the reception hall with the cool night air brushing against my face, the sound of muffled music fading behind the heavy doors. The valet line was crowded with guests in tuxedos and gowns waiting for their luxury cars. But I did not wait with them. My government-issued Ford Explorer sat quietly in the lot, sturdy and unremarkable. The kind of vehicle that never drew attention yet carried more truth than all the polished chrome parked nearby. Sliding into the driver's seat, I started the engine and let the headlights cut across the manicured hedges. My hands rested on the wheel for a moment before I pulled forward. The road away from the Riverside Country Club curved along the Hudson, the water shimmering faintly in the moonlight. I felt the tension drain from my shoulders as the music and whispers of the reception slipped further behind me. The silence of the drive gave room for memories to surface. I thought back to Omaha, to that old kitchen with the peeling wallpaper and the wooden table where Ethan had shoved a check across the surface and Lauren had told me I was not welcome. Their words had carved scars that took years to stop burning. Tonight, those scars had been seen for what they were. Not weakness, but proof of survival. The image of Annalie flashed in my mind. The way she clung to her mother after being freed. That promise I had whispered to her, that I would get her out, had carried me through the darkest nights of my assignment. Seeing her safe had reminded me what all those years undercover had truly meant. Coach Miller's voice rose from deep memory. That quiet afternoon when I had been nothing more than a tired high school kid stacking cones in the gym. You are stronger than even your family thinks. Rachel, do not let them convince you otherwise. I had not known then how far his words would travel with me. Across oceans. Across years. Into battlefields and undercover lives. And tonight. Into a country club where I had once been told I did not belong. I drove past neighborhoods where families gathered around dinner tables, where lights glowed warm in windows. And I thought about how long I had lived, believing I had to earn a seat at one of those tables. But the truth was different now. I did not need their approval. I did not need their praise. The strength was already mine. Carved by sweat, blood, and choices no one else had dared to make. The best revenge, I realized as the road stretched on, is not living bitter. It is not screaming for recognition or dwelling in anger. The best revenge is living true. Stepping fully into the life you were meant to live without apology. My family had tried to cut me down, had tried to erase me from their picture. But tonight I had stood in their world as myself. Unshaken. Unhidden. That was enough. By the time I reached the interstate, the country club lights were nothing more than a glow on the horizon. The hum of the tires beneath me steadied my thoughts. The woman who had once sat quietly at a kitchen table, shrinking under her siblings' ridicule, was gone. In her place was a marshal who had saved lives. A woman who no longer needed permission to exist with pride. I knew Lauren would have to face the fallout of her own choices. Her in-laws had seen her desperation, her cruelty, and her mask slip beyond repair. Ethan would have to reckon with his debts, stripped of the arrogance he once used to hide behind. None of that belonged to me anymore. Their judgments, their failures, their shame were theirs to carry. What belonged to me was the freedom of walking away without a single ounce of doubt about who I was. As the highway opened wide and the night grew quieter, I allowed myself a small smile. It was not the kind of smile that came from winning an argument. It was the kind that came from knowing you no longer needed to argue at all. And now, to everyone listening, I want to leave you with this. Maybe you have been underestimated, belittled, or pushed aside by people who were supposed to love you. Maybe your own family has made you feel invisible, like you would never measure up. I know how heavy that weight can be, but I also know that your worth is not decided by their words. Tell me in the comments if you have ever been in that place. If you have ever faced family who favored one child over another or dismissed your efforts because they did not fit their picture of success. I want to hear your stories. If this resonated with you, make sure to like this video and subscribe. Because together we are building a space where no one gets erased, where no one has to prove their value to those unwilling to see it. The best revenge is not living bitter, but living true. tonight. I finally understood that. And I hope you do too.